So, human persons are, as far as we know, the most profound point of convergence of the world's basic forms of complexity. Physico-chemical, biological, psychological, informational, and social complexity. We appear to be unique among living species in having the ability to engage in long-range individual and collective planning, or at least planning behavior that greatly exceeds rudimentary foraging and storage behavior. Standing out more dramatically are our abilities to partly control and manipulate the very biological and environmental conditions of our continued survival, and to alter dramatically the circumstances of our day-to-day habitat. Furthermore, we think and act within complex moral and religious narratives, apart from which much of what we do would make no sense. A basic philosophical scientific question is whether these and other remarkable abilities and tendencies signify a discontinuity in the evolutionary processes that gave rise to us, and if so, to what extent and in what form. Each of the many sciences that study facets of human life do so with different methodologies and from different, you might say, altitudes. Whether and how they mesh so as to yield collectively a unified picture is an open question. Some of the sciences have at best advanced to a mid-game stage. Perhaps these sciences merely offer useful models rather than more or less accurate maps of their domains. A common theme running through the life and human sciences is organized complexity. That is, collective phenomena exhibiting robust patterns of activity that are strikingly different from those seen among their constituent elements when not so organized. Theorists in these domains sometimes speak of organized systems exercising emergent or top-down causation or control or constraints over the system's elements. It is tempting for specialists to develop a model of their favored phenomena and then to suggest that the model holds the key to thinking about naturally emergent phenomena generally. But it is rash to assume that there is a single notion of emergence that accurately and usefully applies to all cases of interest. Maybe emergence is more dramatic or fundamentally significant in some cases of pattern complexity than in others. In what follows, I will isolate two distinct senses of emergence, which I will call weak and strong. The notions I have in mind are not orthogonal, but rather of differing logical strengths. That is, strong emergence implies weak emergence, but not vice versa. They signal a basic division on each side of which one may conceive variant forms, possibly such that one may think in terms of degrees of robustness. The contemporary sciences are very complicated and nuanced. This is good for the advancement of knowledge, since the world itself is complicated and nuanced. But the complexity of our best theories can make it difficult to see the fundamental issue I wish to raise. So I will invite us to consider a kind of toy world whose properties and dynamics are quite transparent. It will be easy to isolate my two senses of emergence in relation to this simple kind of world and to grasp what kind of evidence would enable one to decide conclusively whether both notions or merely the weaker one has application. Lessons in hand, I will then return to the target of interest, human persons in the actual complicated world. I think that much importance hinges on whether or not distinctively human attributes are strongly emergent, and I will argue that there is good reason to believe that they are. All right, so first part, the game of life and two forms of emergence. My toy world has conveniently been supplied to us by the mathematician John Conway in the form of his so-called cellular automaton, the game of life. Versions of the game of life are readily available online. We are to imagine life as a two-dimensional grid without outer bounds. So you imagine it spreading out infinitely in all directions. It is dynamic, changing its array of properties over time, and in it, space and time are discrete or chunky rather than continuous or very roughly infinitely divisible, as in our own world. The advantage of this is one doesn't need calculus to determine rates of change and limit values. So it's much easier to see what's going on. A life world is given an arbitrary initial state, call it its Big Bang if you like, This consists simply in each of the grid's square cells having one of two basic properties, live or dead. There's no mass, charge, spin, momentum, just live and dead. Okay? Very, very simple world. Right? And so think of it as the live cells being colored dark. They're the dark squares, the dead cells being white. And you assign every cell, you either color it white or black, live or dead. That's it. Okay? Those are the basic properties. That gives you the state of the world at its first moment in time. We'll call that T1. Every subsequent state of the grid, starting with time T2, because remember time is not continuous, so you jump from time atom T1 to time atom T2, so nice and simple, is wholly determined by applying, every subsequent stage is wholly determined by applying the following three rules to every cell. These are given on your handout. And remember that every cell has 8 neighbors in every direction if you include diagonally. Okay, so there's 8 neighboring cells for any cell. And here are the 3 rules that determines what happens to a cell at the next moment. Birth rule. A dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes a live cell. Survival rule. A live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors stays alive. And then finally, the death rule. In all other cases, a cell dies or remains dead. So as that little diagram that you have on your handout illustrates, over time, stable clusters of various kinds arise, and they exhibit macro-level dynamical patterns of their own that are different from the micro-level dynamical patterns. When clusters come into contact, they often exhibit still newer patterns of interaction with each other. So common sorts of interactions in life worlds have been given apt names such as oscillator, glider, puffer, and eater. Once these clusters appear, their macro-level behavior can be studied in ignorance of the 3 micro-level rules that underlie them. Interestingly, different sorts of high-level patterns are observed in life games that have different initial conditions. Fundamentally different types of high-level patterns, just depending on what the initial state was. And it's all determined by the basic rules. So we may think of the 3 basic rules in the world's initial state as constituting its fundamental physics. The high-level patterns can be thought of as its chemistry, or in more complex scenarios, its biology. These high-level patterns exhibit what I will call weak or physics-closed emergence. They are emergent in the sense that one cannot, in any straightforward way, derive the high-level rules from the fundamental rules alone. The only information you're given is, here are the 3 fundamental rules. Tell me what kinds of macroscopic rules there are. You wouldn't be able to derive it just from that information. In that sense, they are emergent. So I define weak emergence on your handout as being simply holds just in case some aspects of the behavior of a specifiable type of composite organized system exhibit ongoing or recurrent law-like patterns that, outside this organizational context, are not exhibited by the system's components. The high-level rules of life are only weakly emergent in that they do not alter or supplement the basic dynamics that drive the world's evolution. That is, the physics of a standard life world, what I'm calling the physics of a standard life world, is causally closed, with each total configuration of the grid at a time t1 being strictly determined by its state at the previous time t0 in accordance with the 3 basic rules alone. This physics is silent about the high-level patterns, but it nonetheless captures what happens in each of the grids that collectively constitute any such pattern phenomena, right? The high-level theory that applies to composites such as gliders, guns, and eaters, its concepts and its dynamical rules, is irreducible to the cellular theory. It constitutes a relatively autonomous explanatory system such that we can predict and explain macro-level phenomena using only our knowledge of macro-level laws and facts. Absent the disruption of collisions with merely physical clusters, of course. Just as in our world, biology is not going to tell you what will happen next when a meteor strikes a local ecosystem. Biology only holds under certain parameter conditions. When those conditions are not met, you've got to go to the physics if you want to have any kind of explanation of what's happening. Similarly, in life world. These are patterns that hold within certain constraints, but then if some kind of amorphous blob kind of starts shifting across the life world and bangs into one of these entities, you're not going to get neat high-level rules describing what's going on. Moreover, a biological explanation of a biologically configured state is more illuminating for certain purposes than a merely physical explanation, right? Explanation is interest-driven, right? And depending on what you're wanting to do, if you want to understand in terms of the macroscopic shape and of the entities what's going on, then the physics explanation is not really going to illuminate. It's not going to give you the kind of answer you're looking for. If we not only observe but intervene in the life world in godlike fashion, by manipulating the value of one higher level variable while holding constant other relevant factors, we can change the value of another high level variable in very predictable ways and in a variety of contexts. This indicates that we have not only high level explanation, but also a kind of high level causal explanation. However, this theoretical or explanatory irreducibility in standard life worlds is matched by what I'll call ontological or causal reduction. The state of every stable cluster at any moment is wholly fixed and constituted by the properties of each of its cells and their arrangement. And the cluster's evolution over time is fundamentally determined by the basic physical laws. Each macro-level event, such as a glider's changing position over a time interval, has a micro-level cause. The sum total, that is, of the micro-level causes of each of its components, positions, and behavior. Crucially, the micro-level causation determines the macro-level causation and not vice versa. Macro-level events, then, aren't doing anything extra over and above what the micro-level events are doing in order to bring about the position and behaviors of gliders, eaters, and the like. They do not make a non-redundant causal difference to the behavior of the objects in a life world. The patterns, interesting patterns of a certain kind, but they're not making a fundamental difference above and beyond what the micro-level laws are doing to drive the world's evolution forward. Thus, macro-level objects and events in such worlds are weakly emergent only, theoretically or explanatorily irreducible, but ontologically and causally derivative. All right, once one gets used to looking at things in this way, ontological and causal reductionism can begin to seem inevitable, both in any imaginable variety of simulated life world and in any law-governed physical world such as ours, notwithstanding our world's added complexity of 3 spatial dimensions, a richer inventory of basic properties and continuity in space and time. Surely, the thought goes, any sort of organized, complex phenomena must be grounded in comprehensive underlying patterns that hold without exception. This thought is mistaken. We can see this by considering variations on standard life worlds, where ontological and causal reduction fail. Okay? So here, imagine, I'm going to imagine such a variation. So imagine you're handed a tall stack of very large, consecutively numbered sheets of what we call graph paper, right? Paper with grids. Of course, they're not going to be infinite flat sheets of paper, but very large, we'll suppose. So they're numbered. You got a stack, say, of 1,000 sheets of paper. On them are changing snapshots of a life world, where again the shaded squares are the live cells. You've now, unlike what I've told you, but in this scenario, you have not been told the basic transitional rules, and your job is to figure them out. So our physicists here would love this kind of challenge, right? And what are you going to do? Well, after flipping through several pages, right, and you kind of see what kind of transitions are going on, you're trying to figure out what compact rules would capture and then kind of generalize and capture everything that's going on everywhere. Kind of a lot of hit or miss, different kind of algorithms. I don't know. Our physicists probably would have some neat algorithms that the rest of us, it would just be very laborious. But eventually, after flipping through several pages, you hit upon the birth, survival, and death rules as the most compact ways to capture all the transitions going on in each cell. Now, continuing to check subsequent pages, you observe that on page number 505, the result departs in a small way from what the rules predict. You observe further that the divergence is restricted to a complex star-shaped cluster that first appeared on the previous page. Flipping ahead, you observe that as more of these star-shaped clusters predictably appear, their subsequent evolution, too, departs from what the three basic rules predict. Further investigation reveals that the form the divergences take is identical. You now can predict, upon seeing the emergence of the star shape, what the future world states will be using modified, disjunctive forms of the original rules. So the new birth rule has the form, a dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes a live cell, except when occurring within the bounds of or immediately adjacent to a star cluster, in which case such and such, and then you compactly describe what will happen. Imagine that as multiple star clusters come into contact, new modifications of the original rules are required to fully capture the way they interact. You find that in the end, the most compact way to capture all the behavior is, 1, to assign primitive new properties, call them bright or golden, to star clusters, and then 2, to describe the precise impact of these emergent properties of the clusters on the ordinary micro-level dynamics via additional laws that are no less fundamental, even though they apply only in limited contexts. The 3 basic rules are not enough at this point. You have to say that in certain contexts, when a certain organizational threshold is met of a specifiable sort, right, then you've got to appeal to this set of additional rules to explain what's going to go on in that context. Well, so this world you've been given to inspect exhibits what I will call strong emergence, and I define it on your handout this way. Some aspects of the behavior of a specifiable type of composite organized system exhibit ongoing or recurrent law-like patterns that, outside this organizational context, are not exhibited by the system's components. Okay, that's just weak emergence. But then furthermore, if one attempted to capture the underlying micro-level transitions in terms of the concepts of the lower-level theory, the resulting laws would be massively disjunctive. They'd be ugly, and refer to macroscopic structural features. From this, we should conclude that the microphysical realm is not causally closed. Certain properties of wholes directly affect microphysical phenomena, adding to the basic causal principles that govern how the world unfolds. Worlds manifesting strong emergence in this way are plainly coherent possibilities. The opposing hypothesis that everything that happens is wholly fixed by compact micro-regularities without regard to macro context is not an a priori truth. It's a substantive empirical thesis, if it's true. So there ought to be no presumption, one way or another, in advance of a sufficiently thorough investigation of the empirical facts. As the early 20th century emergentist Samuel Alexander put it, we should come to the world, quote, with the natural piety of the investigator. Just look and see what kind of world we inhabit. Is it a world with strong emergence, or is it a world merely with weak emergence? We know it's a world with weak emergence, our world, right? There are interesting, robust macroscopic patterns that can be given useful explanatory descriptions. That is, there's chemistry, there's biology, there's psychology, there's meteorology, there are lots of levels of organized complexity. We know that. That's enough to secure weak emergence. The only question then is whether some of those weakly emergent phenomena are also strongly emergent. That is, they involve properties of the whole that are playing a fundamental causal difference to how even the components of the whole are unfolding over time.
Sorry, could you give me an example?
An example. That is a uncontested empirical example? Yeah. I was going to refer, actually, so, I mean, hypothetically, the idea would just be, I'm going to talk about some contentious claims people sometimes make about strong emergence in the actual world, but the idea would just be, sorry, this is a metaphysician. I like to think in very abstract terms. For me, it's easier, but I think maybe what you're crying out for is a kind of more concrete kind of example. Well, to anticipate where I'm going, Suppose that certain of our conscious mental properties make a causal difference to how we behave, and mental properties are not merely organized, our mental states are not simply complexly organized physical states, right? And they are further properties, fundamental properties, and they're making a causal difference to how we behave. That would be an example of causation. The weak emergentist interpretation of the same phenomenon would be, no. Your mental properties, any given instance of your being in a mental state is realized by a complex arrangement of neurophysiological entities and those further down, ultimately microphysical entities, right? And yes, there's interesting level of description that's irreducible, mental level description to physical description, but it's all fixed by constituted by the microphysical. So the question is going to be whether certain properties are not wholly constituted by and fully determined by the underlying stuff of the complex system. I'll point to a little bit later on, but I'm going to say, okay, what kind of evidence is there? Right now, I'm just trying to get the conceptual idea out. Do you feel like you have that? Okay. Strongly emergent properties and patterns. I think it's important to point out that strongly emergent properties and patterns, if such there be, can be empirically studied and theorized about, no less than weakly emergent ones. The new patterns, once discovered, and the conditions of their appearance learned, will become wholly predictable, as I was indicating with the star example. There are sufficient conditions involving organized complexity of a very certain specific kind for their appearance. Or, if the emergent laws are not indeterministic, there are at least objective probabilities associated with such conditions. Given that this is so, to make sense of such new phenomena, we need only enrich our inventory of the fundamental unit properties, supposing that in addition to live and dead, whose dispositional profiles are largely captured by the original unmodified rules, these cells also have a set of dispositions towards cooperatively contributing to just such behavioral discontinuity, a disposition that is merely latent outside the requisite macro circumstance. As we might say, the seeds of every strongly emergent macro property and the behavior it manifests are there all along in the world's fundamental elements. So, the 19th century mathematician, physicist Laplace, right, famously kind of corrected Newton's interpretation of his own theory, said we don't need God to kind of push the planets back into their orbits every now and then. But anyway, Laplace had this vision of imagining a calculator, a godlike being that could had no computational limits, right, and could observe all the basic entities of our world and knew the physical laws, and so could deduce, right, he had a deterministic vision, could deduce every subsequent state as the world evolves over time, right? And the idea would be if there was a world with strong emergence, in our Laplacian calculator, unlike God, who doesn't just sort of a priori have knowledge of what all the fundamental rules are, because he created the world to have those, right? But he's just learning empirically, right? He has no computational limit. Well, until there is emergence, right, he's going to think, well, it's just these basic rules that captures everything, right? And then just all of a sudden, he's going to say, whoops, okay, I've got this little divergence over here, like, double check my calculations, no, something's different is happening here. And so he's learning that in certain organized contexts, the behavior is not fully captured by the simple micro-level regularities. And eventually he's going to theorize, so built within the elements of, because everything in this universe is built out of the same stuff, right? So it must be that latent within this stuff is this hidden disposition that only kicks in the right kind of organized context. You need this threshold of organized complexity before these further dispositions kick in to generate these gestalt or holistic properties of the whole, right? Which then in turn have a measurable impact on the behavior of the system as it unfolds. That's the kind of idea. All right, but we're now at part 2, strong emergence and consciousness. So armed with the basic distinction between weak and strong emergence, we can ask ourselves whether specific forms of organized complexity in our own world involve weak emergence only or are instead forms of strong emergence. Some scientists and philosophers of science seem to think, wrongly, in my judgment, that strong emergence, while possible, is inherently improbable given the methods of science and especially the advances of physical and biological science from the beginning of the 20th century, roughly. Reasons for this negative judgment are partly historically rooted, and I don't have time to discuss those. Here I will merely note that there is a tendency among thinkers trained in the methods of empirical science to conflate what we have reason to believe is true with what we have methodological reason to take as the most fruitful starting hypothesis. Even if, say, the mental is strongly emergent from the physical, and I'm going to suggest we have reason to believe in a moment, if you wish to understand the details of just how mental features emerge and the precise difference they make to the overall functioning of the organism, you must have a thorough understanding of the purely physical processes from which they emerge. That's the only way you can kind of get a functional causal handle on just what difference it makes. You have to kind of see how things are different, and that means having a very good theory of what's going on in terms of the basic laws governing its elements. Thus, in practice, you should push a reductionist approach as far as you can, thereby isolating any emergent features there may be, allowing for highly specific descriptions of their character and function. Unlike the philosopher, your typical scientist does not spend much time thinking about what will turn out to be true at the end of scientific inquiry. Rather, she is thinking about what working hypotheses are most useful in advancing current understanding. It is easy but mistaken to slide from the quite proper methodological stance of looking for reducing explanations to drawing an unwarranted evidential conclusion that a thoroughgoing reductionism is true. Given the inevitably partial nature of our knowledge of any given domain and our computational limits, I believe the issue of strong emergence is difficult to adjudicate in most cases of organized complexity. However, it's worth noting that there are scientists who seem to advocate a strong emergentist interpretation of certain phenomena. So, for example, the Nobel laureate physicist Robert Laughlin, in his work on superconductivity, I refer to a title of a book of his on the back of your handout. The Nobel laureate chemist Ilya Prigogine, in his work on so-called dissipative structures and thermodynamical systems far from equilibrium, and the Royal Society fellow, Oxford biologist Dennis Noble, on the self-maintaining character of life itself. I am not confident, unlike these folks, I am not confident that any of these thinkers are right about their favorite cases. It seems to me that they do not clearly separate weak and strong forms of emergence, and that this weakens the case that they make. It's actually a bit unclear whether they really intend something like what I call a strong emergence. I find them kind of ambiguous. But, however matters, I have no dog in that fight, in any of those fights. But however matters may stand for such physical and biological phenomena, there is powerful evidence for strong emergence right under our noses, so to speak, in the form of our own and other animals' conscious mental lives. Each time we observe the world in some way, we are simultaneously, so right now you're looking out at me, you're having a visual awareness of this room and of me and things behind me. So you're aware of the room and the objects in the room, but at the same time you're aware of something else, namely your experience of this bit of the world. Right? You can reflect on the qualitative character right now of your visual experience itself. Right? If I were to dim the lights right now, the room wouldn't change in any dramatic way, and yet your visual experience of the room would change quite significantly. Right? So the experience, the way the room appears to you is distinct from the way the world is. But you're aware of that appearance, right? As well as being aware, it's via that appearance that you're aware of the room. Your mind represents the room as being a certain way to you. You have this immediate apprehension of the visual appearance to you, right? And that's your way of coming to have kind of information about the room itself. So this awareness of the room consists in a certain kind of mental representational state you're in, caused in large part by a very rapid but complex process of light reflectances off the surfaces of bodies and so on, By contrast, you are aware of the inner representational state itself, your awareness of me, your awareness of me. That's where the stress should be, right? You're aware of your awareness of me simply by having it. Your acquaintance with it requires no causal or representational mediation. It's ontologically basic. Your subjective visual experience of this room and its contents consists in a unified package of what we might call the looks of color, shape, size, relative size, and orientation to yourself. Right? These ways the objects appear to you, the intrinsic character of your experience, again, can change without the objects undergoing significant change at all. Right? So you're aware of navy blue, right? I'm a bit colorblind, so sometimes precise color identification. So it's whoa, sorry about that. Navy blue shirt. I'll try not to look down. You're aware of it, right? And there's a kind of simple quality to your, right? A relatively simple visual quality to it, right? But physicists tell us, right? There's no such simple primitive property of navy blue color somehow smeared over the surface of the of the shirt, right? Right? In the way that Aristotle thought there was. Aristotle being the good scientist that he was, but being restricted to simple observation, he sort of took the world at face value. It looks like to us as if there is a simple kind of color quality smeared across the surface of objects, but there isn't, right? That's why you get people like Galileo saying shocking things to some people. There are no colors. It's just subjective, right? What we should say about that is, well, there are colors in the sense that there are properties, objective properties that are responsible for the fact that all of us, if we have similar visual systems, will have a similar, we presume, experiential experience of the shirt, discounting for things like color blindness and so on, right? But so there are properties on the shirt, but that simple-looking quality is actually a property of your experience. So that shows you're aware of something in your experience itself, right? That color, the look of a color, right, is a property of your experience, not of the shirt. This might be a big revelation to some of you, but get used to it. This is the way it is. We know this, okay? Now, your visual field is usually quite complex, but this complexity is, we might say, all surface complexity. It's built up out of elements that are individually quite simple, like if you hone in on, not to get too personal, but a little patch of the shirt here on this right here, this region. Yeah, there's a little bit of shading variation, right? That if you were a visual artist, you'd pay very careful attention to how all that's going on with the light, shadows, and so forth. But it's relatively simple color quality in that patch, right? And these simple, and basically your visual experience is built up out of lots of little patches of color and relative sizes and shapes. If we just focus on your visual field, and of course there's the qualities of the way things sound to you, right? Which again are not primitive sound-like things out there in the world. There's just sound waves, right? But there's the subjective experience of sound, that technicolor experience of sound. So here's the claim. Okay, what this little philosophical reflection on perception, what's the point of it? It's this. These simpler elements of conscious experience cannot plausibly be identified with anything physical. The only candidates for such an identification, these qualities of your experience, like the look of a certain color, would be a complex token neural state, perhaps somewhat distributed in your brain, depending on how future brain science goes. And the intrinsic properties of these neural states are plainly not introspectively graspable, and certainly do not have the structural simplicity that phenomenal navy blueness has, right? Neuroscience is not that easy, right? We don't introspectively have any direct grasping of neuroscientific properties of our brains, but we do have a direct grasp of simple qualities of our experiences, right? And indeed, as neuroscience and further down elementary particle physics progresses, the idea of an empirical identification of a basic, simple experiential quality with some physical state seems more and more fantastic. The layered structural complexity of any given smallish region, even, of our brains is quite extraordinary. So what goes for visual experience, I'm almost done here. What goes for visual experience goes for conscious mental phenomena generally. Other kinds of perceptual experiences, auditory experiences, tactile experiences, have subjective aspects, right, that have a structural simplicity, right? Conscious thoughts, feelings, moods, beliefs, desires, intentions. All of these states have intrinsic subjective aspects that are not describable in purely third-personal terms. So, while our conscious mental states undoubtedly have complex sustaining causes, the future identification of which is part of the business of neuroscience, the conscious states themselves are distinct, in large part caused by, but not identical to, structured physical states of the brain. If this is so, then their being strongly emergent follows, given only the evident fact that these states are causally efficacious in all sorts of familiar ways. All right, so conclusion. The implications of an emergentist perspective on human beings are broader than I've been able to develop here. Just kind of made an initial case for thinking that certain aspects of our mental lives are emergent. But the implications extend to moral and religious perspectives. As I discussed yesterday, all of us see human beings as having a special dignity in nature as self-directed agents, properly subject to moral appraisal. We also view human beings as having moral worth, such that imposing harm or death on human beings is, in most circumstances, a grave moral wrong. It is very hard to see, from a clear-eyed metaphysical point of view, how or why these things should be true if all the attributes of human persons are derivative and do not, in the final analysis, make any fundamental difference to how the world unfolds. At the same time, an emergentist perspective, as opposed to a stronger sort of mind-body dualism, is in line with a conciliatory attitude between science and religion. On the one hand, it avoids positing a this far and no further attitude to the attempt to attain a thorough scientific understanding of the fundamental processes that make up the ongoing lives of the remarkable animals that are human beings. On the other hand, it also serves to remind one of the very partial and ongoing nature of scientific inquiry, encouraging the humility and open-mindedness characterizing the scientific spirit at its noblest. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for sticking to time, which means we have question opportunity. So, there must be some questions. Yes, over there. Can you use the microphone, please, because some people can't hear.
Nancy Murphy, when she talks about this, uses the concept of supervenience.
Yeah.
And yesterday, supervenience was rather poo-pooed as an idea. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't think of this in terms of supervenience.
Could you just
Right, but I'm assuming most people don't know what that's a philosopher's term of art. The idea of supervenience is supposed to be high-level phenomena. It's really weak emergence is supervenience. That's the idea that the high-level properties supervene on, that is, are fixed by and constituted by the underlying properties, right? So the way that a painting, is at the end of the day, the overall image that is depicted in a painting is fixed by and wholly determined by the individual arrangement of dots of blobs of paint, right? You might say they supervene the overall image, whatever aesthetic properties it has, whether it's beautiful or ugly or whatever, supervene on the arrangement of the pixels, right, of paint. And that I take to be a weak emergentist. So I have a stronger notion of emergence in mind, I think, than Nancy does, although I sometimes have difficulty interpreting her too.
I think the ultimate problem is whether all causation is at the level of the physical ultimately, and whether these mental properties and so on actually do exhibit their own kind of causality and top-down causation and so on. And I'm confused too about Nancy Murphy for this reason, because supervenience would seem to say not, whereas she does talk about top-down causation. So, I mean, do you want to just comment on that?
Okay, good. Yeah, because it is possible to have a weak emergentist perspective. You say, look, ultimately, microphysics reigns supreme in a kind of, without any funky emergence kicking in at any point in the unfolding drama. But, of course, when particles get bound up in organized structures, right, sometimes those structures impose boundary constraints on how those individual elements are going to behave. And in that sense, if that's all you mean by top-down causation, well, that's just everywhere, right? So to go back to an old example of the neuroscientist Roger Sperry, you know, a particle embedded in a wheel rolling down a hill, its trajectory is bounded by, highly constrained by the structural properties of the wheel, like the fact that it's in a certain configuration. But that it's possible to think of cases like that as simply particles, so to speak, coming to constrain themselves. That is, obeying simple fundamental laws. They come to be arranged in these stable structures, right? But the continuing of those stable structures is itself ultimately fixed by the very same basic microphysical regularities that held at all times. And so the thought is, you just have to widen out your view and say, yeah, if you just isolate this particle in relation to this wheel, it can look like there's some irreducible top-down causation going on. The wheel's determining where the particle goes, right? But if you broaden out your view, if you're a Laplacian calculator, you just say, well, ultimately that is part of a larger phenomena. Each individual element in that whole, in the overall physical thing, is just, you know, involving whatever the dynamical rules are that govern how particles interact locally. So it's the appearance of a kind of top-down constraint. I mean, it's real. I mean, it's really, it's a real kind of organized phenomena. But it's not that, there's no fundamental law that somehow supplements the basic physics. There being that kind of stable arrangement is fully explained by the microphysical rules. It's an abstract, it's a subtle, this issue is super subtle, and it's frustrating because I've talked with many scientists, and that's why I say it's hard to interpret them, because I'm thinking about it in the way philosophers do, very abstract kinds of ways, and you know, the scientists are typically immersed in the details and saying, but look, you know, when Dennis Noble talks about life, you know, genes don't, you know, dictate anything, it's only the organism, right? It's kind of in his polemic against Richard Dawkins, right, that tells the gene what it's going to do and how it's going to function. I don't want to deny that that's from a systems biology standpoint. I trust him. That's what's going on. That doesn't automatically mean that there's strong emergence. And I think so. I think, you know, and which is true in the case of life, which is true in the case of thermodynamic phenomena that William Prigogine used to talk about before he died. Well, that's an interesting theoretical question. You know, is it strong emergence or merely weak emergence? But we care when it comes to human beings, right? About whether we really do make a difference, right? And whether our behavior is, at the end of the day, entirely fixed by impersonal, you know, laws of motion, so to speak, or whatever, you know, modern day successors of those are. And it's just the outworking of those. Everything about us, everything about our subjective lives, our choices, our goals.
Not to free will.
I mean, free will, of course, goes out the window, but everything, even what we care about. You know, why do we care about states of pain and pleasure, right? That is, we think it's wrong to gratuitously inflict suffering on human beings or other animals for no good reason, right? Why do we think that's wrong, right? Well, we think there's something intrinsically about the character of states of pain, right? Intense psychic pain within a conscious organism, right? That's a bad state of affairs, okay? Why should that? Why does that have fundamental moral significance in the way that the intrinsic state of that chair does not? If on the weak emergentist perspective, fundamentally speaking, they're just slightly different arrangements. It's the same basic kind of stuff. It's the, you know, it's just matter in motion, so to speak. The, you know, updated version of the ancient Democritus kind of vision. And it's really hard to say why should those kinds of structured physical states have intrinsic moral significance in ways that others don't. So I really think we're deeply committed as human beings to a anti-reductionist picture of that sort. And I think we need the notion of at least strong emergence. Of course, the alternative of strong emergence that's also non-reductionist is to say that human beings are fundamentally simple mental substances, souls that interact with bodies, and that are the bearers of these primitive psychological properties. I don't have time to get into why I prefer an emergentist picture, but I think it just better meshes with what we know about the deeply embodied nature of human beings, but I don't have time to get into that.
Okay, there's one at the back there. You may have just opened with a big
Yes.
can of worms there.
That's what philosophers do. We
Yeah.
pose a big problem and then we create a
Could you possibly comment on the relationship, if any, between emergence that you spoke about and chaos theory? And would you think that it is reasonable?
Whose theory?
Chaos. Chaos.
Oh, chaos. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Excuse me.
Yes.
And would it be reasonable to say that whatever solution, explanation, or description of what you discussed should meet something, a requirement which would go maybe something like this: explanation should explain that one who is explaining. That is, a philosopher standing there who explains what is going on should also explain him, being able and actually explaining the phenomenon, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I fear that it's hard to give a simple answer to that second question, but the first thing about chaos theory, actually we've got a speaker coming later this morning who could talk about this in much greater detail than I can, but it's this idea of phenomena that, organized phenomena that are highly sensitive, for example, to the initial conditions of the system, right? Such that if you were, the butterfly effect kind of thing, the butterfly flapping its wings off in South America, having some huge macroscopic, this is a popular way of representing the idea. I take that to be consistent with weak emergence. It's just saying, it's making a point about computational complexity in terms of the ability to actually be able to derive what will happen and how much information you would need, right, to do it. But it's not saying anything about whether there are fundamental top-down influences driving behavior. So I'm just going to stop at that point, partly because I'm not like that to talk about such systems. But you're right about, you say, well, look, if somebody's got a grand theory on which persons kind of disappear from the grand theory, well, then what's going on? Is there some kind of self-undercutting phenomena going on? Because why are we believing this? Well, because we take ourselves to be talking to a person who's communicating successfully, who really is in certain informational states, right, states of belief, is seeking to communicate those to us in the form of an argument in order for us to accept a conclusion. And if the theory ends up saying that, strictly speaking, such phenomena don't exist, well, then there's a problem. But there are different moves that can be made here. But I agree, one has to go careful there. Someone who's got a very strongly reductionist vision, unless they end up sawing off the branch on which they sit. Yeah.
There's a question down here, John.
My question is along the same lines as the previous speaker.
Okay.
I'm a ignorant meteorologist. In weather forecasting, what you do basically is you have got lots of observations at various points. You put them into a large computer, you apply the laws of physics, you hope. And depressions and so on emerge. Now, a bit of experience shows that this does not have the same conditions, do the calculations, then you can do them again and you get a different solution. Saying the results are very sensitive to initial conditions. So you can't look into the future very far.
Right.
And in fact, the way they do weather forecasting is they do a lot of calculations then they vary the input very slightly, and do them again, and do them again, and do them again. If you look at weather forecasts, you can see this, what the results are. So they start telling you in 5 days' time, the big depression is going to form over you and you have dead cows. You can see all the results are converging. If they just keep quiet about what's happening, obviously all the results are diverging. And I don't quite know how this affects what you're saying, but it means really it is very difficult to see organised systems just emerging. Now, the same applies to economics, as meteorologists and some are always being told by the people who do economic models. Exactly, they look very, very similar to ecological models, just change the terms, and you see exactly the same results. We can't really forecast what's going to happen in the economy very far into the future.
Right.
If we could, we wouldn't have big crashes, and the bankers would be, well, they make lots of money anyway. They'd be very rich. No, they probably wouldn't. But I think that's the thing, but I enjoy your talk very much, very interesting. But I'm a little worried as to what's going to emerge out of a very simple system, and that does actually relate to what we observe in the real world.
Yeah. So I take the point that these have to do with our computational limits, even given our most powerful computers and so on. There's only so many variables we can track, right, and monitor. And if the dynamical laws that govern how these complex systems unfold are very sensitive to the details, exactly what's being inputted, then we have a breakdown in our predictive capacity. And then the only hope would be that you might see, make different assumptions about those details that you can't know, and you get a kind of well-defined maybe probability distribution of outcome. Well, so we've got about 50, relative to the state of our knowledge, it's 50% likelihood of this, as opposed to this kind of meteorological phenomena. That's all about talking about not any kind of intrinsic inbuilt limits, you might say, to the physics of how things unfold. It's all about the limits of our ability to model at a certain high level of description what's going on, and to be able to model it in such a way that we can usefully predict. So it's measuring the limits of our knowledge, right? And as opposed to any limits of the physical processes, the underlying physical processes to capture that. So in a way, you might say, well, so is that weak or strong emergence? Well, I take it insofar as it's an interesting organized phenomenon that can usefully be described in high-level meteorological terms as opposed to fundamental physical terms. Then it's a kind of what I'm calling it's at least a weakly emergent phenomenon, even if the models are not as predictively powerful as we would like. But I don't think it's touching the question of whether there's strong emergence. Yeah.
Quick question if you can't, and then I'll have time for one more.
Yeah. So how different is strong emergence from dualism? And particularly, can you distinguish empirically? Is there any experiment you could run to say that our world is strong emergent or dualist when it comes to human beings?
Yeah, so a strong emergentist picture of human beings says we are physically composed objects. We have no non-physical parts. Okay? It's just that we do have capacities that are capacities of the whole organism that, in the way in which I tried to articulate, do not consist in the outworkings of the capacities of our parts and their interrelationships. These are fundamental capacities, right? Even though they are properties or capacities of organized systems. The dualist says you've got irreducible capacities, but they reside within this separate substance that then interacts with the brain. Now, it would depend on how we tell the stories, but I think on the most plausible way of trying to work out that picture, there are going to be differences in terms of what you would predict, because, it's hard. This is a very abstract. I do think there are differences, but I mean, one would be this. So on the dualist view, right, because it's a simple substance, the mind, bearer of psychological attributes and capacities of choice and belief formation and so on. It's got to have built into it, any given mind or soul, all the capacities that it has. It can't gain new fundamental capacities by, say, cell differentiation, becoming a more complex structure, right? But our bodies do, right? Or developmentally, right? Grow in complexity. So the dualist is going to have to say that even in that, newborn baby, there already is the capacity to do calculus, right? It's there in the mind. It's just waiting for the body to mature in order for the mind to be able to do its thing, right? As opposed to on an emergentist picture, new capacities are coming on board all the time, presumably. Layers of mental complexity as the organism matures. And so presumably that's going to make an empirical difference. That's about all the best I can say about that. A book, if you're a philosopher, if you're so inclined, there is a collection of essays by a small group of philosophers who do want to defend this kind of mind-body dualism called the soul hypothesis. And at least a couple of them are philosophers of science, and they get into these very detailed discussions and wanting to say, actually. Anyway, it's a 2010 volume.
Last question, David.
Moving to the human sphere, has anybody tried, and I'd be interested in your view, whether it's possible, to apply the same sort of thinking to the emergence of religions over hundreds of years? The basic building block is your person.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously the environment changes, and every now and again gives a kick. Is that?
There have been people. I'm not as so fond of this because I think this gets a bit woolly. Maybe you find the view I already defended as being a bit woolly. But so I mentioned Samuel Alexander in his Gifford lectures in 1920s. He was a Scottish philosopher, space, time, and deity. Right, and so his okay, yeah, so persons are emergent in some strong sense, but we don't stop there. Persons are themselves become individuals in complex social arrangements. Societies could perhaps exhibit socially emergent properties, and then, I really don't quite get it, but then, deity somehow being a kind of emergent phenomena of the whole. That's where I completely lose it, and I just haven't looked carefully enough at what he was trying to do to even properly appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, there's no a priori reason why you would think that the apex of emergence would be the human being, right, as opposed to more complex social phenomena in which human beings are embedded. So it becomes an empirical question. Is there reason to think that whole societies function in a kind of way that exhibit fundamental causal relations on how their individual members behave that can't be captured in principle by understanding the local interactions with individual human beings and summing that all together? Of course, there are computational limits, but the idea is, in principle, from a God's eye perspective, would there be an explanatory breakdown if you tried to do it all in individualistic terms? And you do get sociologists of a more philosophical bent that wax lyrical on these kinds of themes.